Isla Mercer never expected her life to shatter into two different versions of herself. But New York had a way of breaking people down and forcing them to rebuild from the fragments. By day, she was just another face in Queens, a part-time bookkeeper at a laundromat where the fluorescent lights flickered and the smell of detergent clung to her clothes like a second skin. She would hunch over spreadsheets filled with someone else's money, her chestnut hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her green eyes hollow from sleepless nights, spent calculating how to keep her sister alive for one more month. But the moment the sun set, that woman disappeared. By night, Isla transformed into someone else entirely at Noor, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where the elite came to see and be seen. She moved between tables of millionaires and moguls with a grace that masked the exhaustion in her bones. Her smile sharp enough to earn tips that paid for hospital bills, her wit quick enough to make powerful men laugh while she secretly despised their careless wealth. She had learned that in New York, survival meant becoming whoever you needed to be, and she had claimed both versions of herself without apology. At 27, she had nothing that resembled a life, just a crumbling studio apartment, a pile of debt her father had abandoned her with, a sister whose heart was failing, and an orange cat named Pretzel who was the only living thing that never demanded anything from her. Yet somehow, despite the exhaustion that had settled into her very soul, something still flickered inside her, a stubborn flame that refused to die, as if she was waiting for something to change, something to break the endless cycle of surviving rather than living, though she had long stopped believing that such a thing was possible. So besties, if you want to know what happens when this struggling waitress accidentally sits on the lap of New York's most dangerous mafia boss, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good enemies to lovers story. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of Isla and Raphael's twisted love story. Now let's go back to the night that changed everything. That night began like any other night at Noor. Isla had just finished a 6-hour shift, her feet aching inside the high-heeled shoes she hated, with a quiet fury, but had to wear because of restaurant rules. She was counting the tips in her apron pocket, trying to calculate whether the amount would be enough to cover this month's electricity bill, when Tessa Blake burst in like a storm, her golden hair flying behind her, and her eyes blazing as if she had just won the lottery. "You won't believe what just happened," Tessa said, her voice almost shouting in the empty staff area. "I just scored 2 VIP tickets to the most exclusive party of the year, the penthouse on the 50th floor of the Meridian Hotel. Nothing but rich and famous people, the kind of party people like us only ever dream of stepping into." Isla looked at her friend with exhaustion written across her face and shook her head immediately. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, untying her apron and hanging it on the hook. "I'm dead tired. I've got to get up early tomorrow to do the bookkeeping for the laundromat, and most importantly, I've got nothing to wear to a party like that." Tessa grabbed Isla's shoulders, turned her around, and looked straight into her eyes with a seriousness she rarely showed. "Isla Mercer, listen to me. How long have you been working almost 20 hours a day? You've lost weight. You look exhausted. You've got dark circles like a panda. And when was the last time you did something just for yourself?" Isla fell silent because she couldn't remember. Her life revolved around work, bills, hospitals, and sleepless nights worrying about Maisie. Joy was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tessa saw the hesitation in her eyes and pressed on. "Listen, maybe you'll meet someone there, an investor, a businessman, someone who could help you escape this life. Or at least for one night, just one, you could forget everything, drink free champagne, eat expensive food, and pretend you're not carrying a mountain of debt and a sister who's dying." That last sentence hit Isla like a knife to the heart. She thought of Maisie lying in the hospital, thought of the $200,000 needed for surgery, thought of how desperate she really was. Maybe Tessa was right. Maybe in that room full of wealthy people, she'd find an opportunity, a lifeline, anything at all. "But I don't have anything to wear," Isla said, her voice weaker now, a clear sign she was wavering. Tessa beamed, knowing she had won. "You think I didn't plan for that? I've got a burgundy silk dress I bought on sale last year and never had a chance to wear. It'll be perfect on you. And don't worry about shoes or accessories. I've got it covered. You just have to show up and look beautiful. That's all." Isla sighed, knowing she had no real excuse left. "Fine," she said, her tone reluctant. Yet somewhere inside her, a small spark of excitement stirred. A part of her she thought had died long ago. "But just one night. After that, I go back to my normal life." Tessa threw her arms around her, laughing softly. "One night is enough to change everything. Trust me." 2 hours later, Isla stood in her cramped studio apartment, Tessa's burgundy silk dress hanging on the closet door, while Pretzel sat on the bed watching her with judgmental yellow eyes as if the cat knew exactly what she was doing. "Just one night," Isla said to the cat, stroking its soft orange fur. "Then everything goes back to normal." Pretzel let out a meow as if it didn't believe her. And honestly, neither did Isla. There was something in the air tonight, a strange, unnameable feeling, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Isla pushed the thought away and began to change. She didn't know that this would be the last night of her old life, and when the sun rose the next morning, she wouldn't ever be the Isla Mercer she once knew again. The private elevator carried them up to the 50th floor of the Meridian Hotel, and when the doors opened, Isla felt as if she had stepped into an entirely different world. The penthouse unfolded before her like a dream woven from money and excess. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed the entire Manhattan skyline, millions of lights glittering like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Crystal chandeliers hovered above, casting a warm golden glow over a room where hundreds of guests were talking, laughing, and sipping champagne from tall, slender flutes. Isla stood frozen, suddenly aware that the burgundy silk dress she had thought was beautiful now looked painfully cheap beside the haute couture gowns and perfectly tailored suits surrounding her. She could smell expensive perfume in the air, the kind where a single bottle cost as much as her rent for an entire month. A server passed by with a tray of champagne, and Tessa swiftly grabbed 2 glasses, handing one to Isla. "Drink it," Tessa whispered. "It's Dom Perignon. 1 glass costs more than all our shifts put together." Isla took a sip, and the champagne melted across her tongue like silk, nothing like the cheap wine she sometimes bought from the corner store. She looked around the room and felt like an intruder, an imposter trying to blend into a world that didn't belong to her. The women wore diamonds around their necks and ears. The men wore watches whose straps alone cost as much as Isla's entire apartment. They talked about yachts in the Mediterranean, about villas in the Hamptons, about million-dollar deals as if they were everyday matters. Isla talked about figuring out how to save enough money to buy medicine for her sister. Tessa, with her natural ability to adapt, was quickly swept into a group, laughing brightly with a middle-aged man wearing a Hermes tie. She glanced back at Isla, winked to signal she was fine, and then disappeared into the crowd, leaving Isla alone in a sea of strangers. Isla stood beside an abstract sculpture that looked like a pile of scrap metal but surely cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, watching the guests around her. She noticed something strange. The faces here were flawlessly beautiful, yet there was something empty in their eyes, as if they were polished wax figures rather than real people. They smiled, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. They spoke, but they weren't truly listening to one another. Isla wondered if this was the price of wealth, trading the soul for a full bank account. She was thinking about finding Tessa and saying she wanted to leave when the music suddenly stopped and a woman in a white suit stepped onto a small stage in the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the woman announced, her voice carrying easily, "it's time for our traditional game, musical chairs, the Elite Edition. The winner will receive a special reserve bottle of Dom Perignon and the title of King of the Night." The crowd cheered and began moving toward the center, where staff were arranging black velvet chairs into a circle. Isla stepped back, having no intention of joining a childish game among this crowd of wealthy strangers. But at that exact moment, Tessa appeared from nowhere, grabbed her hand, and pulled her toward the circle. "Come on," Tessa said, her eyes bright with excitement. "It'll be fun, and who knows, you might win." "I can't." Isla started to protest, but Tessa had already pushed her into the circle with about 20 other people. The music began again, a classical piece remixed with a modern beat, and everyone started moving around the chairs. Isla followed reluctantly, feeling ridiculous and completely out of place. She didn't know that in just a few minutes, this silly game would place her in the lap of the most dangerous man in New York, and her life would never be the same again. The game began, and Isla realized she was circling the chairs alongside heirs, CEOs, and social media stars, with millions of followers. The music drifted through the room, a classical waltz reworked with a modern bass, and everyone moved like swans caught in a strange and elegant dance. For the first few seconds, Isla felt ridiculous, but then something stirred inside her, a competitive instinct she had honed since childhood. Growing up with an alcoholic father and a sick mother, Isla had fought for everything in her life, for food, for attention, for the right to exist. She didn't know how to lose, because losing had always meant dying. The music stopped for the first time, and Isla lunged for the nearest chair with a speed that startled those around her. A woman in a Chanel dress was eliminated. She shrugged and turned toward the bar as if she didn't care. But Isla caught the brief flash of irritation in her eyes. The game continued. The music played and stopped, and each time the circle grew smaller. 15 people, then 12, then 10, then 8. Isla held on, her feet aching inside her heels, but her survival instinct kept her sharp. She began to watch the other players, analyzing their strategies, spotting weaknesses. Some were too slow, some too hesitant, and some were too focused on looking graceful instead of winning. 6 people, then 4. Isla looked around and realized she was one of the final 4, circling the last 3 chairs. The crowd had thickened, people gathering to watch the end of the game, and Isla could feel their eyes on her skin. She focused on the chairs, and that was when she noticed one placed slightly apart from the other 2, closer to the corner of the room. That was her target. She calculated the distance, the angle, the exact moment she needed to move. The music quickened, her heart pounding in time with the bass, and she felt the decisive moment approaching. Then the music stopped. Isla hurled herself toward the isolated chair with all the strength and speed she had, and she sat down. But something was wrong. Instead of the hard, cool surface of velvet, she felt something warm, solid, and unmistakably breathing. Isla's brain took a second to process what had just happened. She had sat down on someone's lap. A man's lap. "Oh God," she blurted out, and tried to jump up, but at that exact moment a hand settled on her waist, not gripping, not yanking, just resting there with the weight of absolute ownership. Then she heard his voice. "Don't." A single word, delivered in a low register cold as steel. A command that didn't allow resistance. Isla froze. "Stay," the voice continued, and this time she could feel the man's warm breath against the back of her neck. Slowly, as if moving through honey, Isla turned her head, and she saw him. The most beautiful and most terrifying man she had ever seen. His jawline was square, as if carved from marble, his eyes a stormy, icy gray, and a faint scar ran from his temple down his left cheek, not marring his face but making him look even more dangerous. His black hair was slicked back from his forehead, and he wore a black 3-piece suit that fit as if it had been tailored on the body of death itself. But what stole Isla's breath wasn't his appearance. It was the way the room reacted to him. All sound stopped. Laughter, conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, everything vanished as if someone had hit mute. Everyone was staring at them, but not with curiosity or amusement. They were staring with fear. Isla saw some people step back, as if instinctively creating distance from whatever was about to happen. "I was aiming for the chair," Isla said, her voice surprisingly steady even though her heart was pounding like a war drum. "And you found something much better," he replied, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Isla felt anger rise in her chest, drowning out the fear she knew she should be feeling. "I don't make a habit of sitting on strangers' laps," she said, lifting her chin. "But when I do, I commit fully." His gray eyes shifted, something flickering there. Maybe amusement, maybe surprise, maybe both. "I appreciate commitment," he said, and the hand on her waist tightened just a fraction. Not enough to hurt, but enough to tell her she wasn't going anywhere until he allowed it. Somewhere in the crowd, Isla heard a whisper loud enough to catch. "Oh God, she just sat on Raphael Corsetti's lap. She's dead." And in that moment, staring into the icy gray eyes of the man beneath her, Isla began to believe the whisper might be right. Isla tried to stand up, but the hand on her waist didn't move. He held her there as if she were something that belonged to him, and that made her angrier than it made her afraid. She had been through too much in her life to fear a man, no matter how dangerous he looked. "Why aren't you afraid?" Raphael asked, his voice carrying a strange note of curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Everyone in this room is afraid of me. They try to hide it, but I see it in their eyes. But you look at me like I'm nothing more than a minor inconvenience in your night." Isla met those gray eyes head on, without blinking, without backing away. "Because I don't know who you are," she said honestly. "And to be frank, I'm too tired to be afraid of anything anymore. I work almost 20 hours a day. I'm carrying a mountain of debt on my shoulders, and my sister is slowly dying in a hospital. Compared to that, a man in an expensive suit with a scar on his face isn't all that terrifying." Something shifted in Raphael's gaze. The coldness was still there, but beneath it, Isla caught a glimpse of something else. Maybe respect, maybe interest. She wasn't sure. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize every line. Then the hand on her waist loosened and fell away. "You're interesting," he said. And it wasn't a compliment, it was a statement. "I'll see you again." Isla stood up at once, her legs slightly unsteady, but she forced herself to stay composed. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked away, feeling his gaze burning into her back. She moved quickly through the crowd, which parted automatically to make room for her, as if she had just been exposed to some kind of contagious disease. Tessa. She needed to find Tessa. Isla spotted her friend near the bar, her face pale as paper. She grabbed Tessa's hand and pulled her into a shadowed corner. "Who is Raphael Corsetti?" Isla asked, her voice low and urgent. "Tell me right now." Tessa stared at her in horror. "Are you out of your mind? You just sat on Raphael Corsetti's lap and lived to tell the story." Tessa gripped Isla's hand, her nails almost digging into her skin. "He's the head of the Corsetti family, one of the 5 most powerful mafia families in New York. He controls half of Manhattan and most of Brooklyn. They say he once tortured a traitor to death with his bare hands, and that's one of the gentler stories. He kills without hesitation. Isla. No one dares to look him in the eye, let alone sit on his lap and talk to him like he's an ordinary man." Isla's heart began to race, but she kept her face calm. "I didn't know. I truly didn't know who he was." "It doesn't matter," Tessa said, her voice almost pleading. "You need to disappear from here right now. Don't let him see you again. Don't let him remember you. Men like him don't have healthy interests, Isla. If he's interested in you, that's not a good thing." Isla nodded and started toward the elevator, Tessa close behind her. But before stepping inside, she couldn't stop herself from looking back one last time. And just as she feared, Raphael Corsetti was still standing where he had been, his gray eyes never leaving her for a single second. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, he didn't make any gesture at all. He simply watched, with the patience of a predator who knows his prey can't escape. The elevator doors slid shut, and Isla let out a breath as if she had been holding it for an entire hour. She thought that would be the last time she ever saw that man. She was wrong. 3 days passed, and Isla tried to forget that night. She returned to her normal life, if working herself to exhaustion could be called normal. During the day, she bent over ledgers at the laundromat. At night, she smiled at customers at Noor, and in the rare moments she had to rest, she went to the hospital to see Maisie. Those icy gray eyes slowly faded from her memory, turning into a strange dream she told herself would never repeat. But on the 4th night, as Isla was serving a familiar table in the corner of the restaurant, she felt a shift in the air. It was like knowing someone was watching you without turning around, an unexplained prickle at the back of her neck. She looked up, and her heart nearly stopped. Raphael Corsetti was walking into Noir, and the room reacted to his presence, as if death itself had just stepped inside. Conversations softened, furtive glances slid toward him and quickly away, and the restaurant manager almost ran to greet him with an expression caught between pride and fear. But Raphael didn't look at the manager. He looked straight at Isla, his gray eyes cutting through the crowded room as if she were the only person who existed. Then he moved toward her section and sat at an empty table. Isla stood frozen, praying someone else would be assigned to serve him, but the universe didn't take her side. The manager came to her, his voice low and urgent. "Mr. Corsetti has requested you personally tonight." Isla shook her head, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I've got 4 other tables. Let someone else handle it." "This isn't a request," the manager said, and Isla saw fear in his eyes. "It's an order. Your other tables have been reassigned. You've got one job tonight. Make him happy." Isla wanted to scream, wanted to say she wasn't a puppet for anyone to pull strings on, but she knew it was useless. This was Raphael Corsetti's world, and she was nothing more than a speck of dust in it. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and walked to his table. "Mr. Corsetti," she said, her voice cold as ice. "How can I help you?" Raphael looked at her, and she could have sworn the corner of his mouth curved slightly. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working," Isla replied. "I don't have time to sit and chat." "You've got time for anything I say you've got time for." Raphael tilted his head, studying her as if she were a piece of art he was deciding whether to buy. "But I won't force you. Serve me the way you serve the others. We've got all night to talk." And they did talk. Between Isla bringing drinks and food, Raphael asked her questions. Where did she live? How long had she worked here? Did she have family? Isla answered with short, sharp replies, revealing nothing that mattered, and she realized Raphael liked that. He liked that she didn't bow to him the way everyone else did. liked that she looked him straight in the eye and said things no one else dared to say. "You're interesting," he said at one point. "You're different." "I'm not different," Isla replied. "I'm just too tired to pretend." Raphael laughed, a rare, low sound, and Isla hated that her heart beat faster when she heard it. "That's what makes you different," he said. "You don't pretend. In my world, everyone wears a mask. But you let me see your real face. That's either very brave or very stupid." "Maybe both," Isla said, and she surprised herself by almost smiling. When Raphael left at the end of the night, he placed a stack of cash on the table that Isla could tell equaled her entire monthly wages. Beneath the money was a small card with neat handwriting. "Dinner, Saturday, 8 o'clock. I'll pick you up." There was no question, no asking for permission, just a statement, as if her agreement were a given. Isla stared at the card in her hand, knowing she should throw it away, should run as far as she could from this man. But some part of her, the part she had buried long ago, the part that longed to live instead of merely survive, wanted to know what would happen next. Isla reached her apartment close to 2 in the morning, her legs aching and her mind still spinning with the image of Raphael Corsetti and the small card tucked into her pocket. She opened the door in the dark, planning to collapse onto the bed and sleep for as long as her body would allow. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, carrying the smell of cigarettes and cheap whiskey, and Pretzel didn't come running to greet her like always. Isla's heart began to race as she reached for the light, and the dim yellow glow revealed the silhouette of a man sitting on her worn-out sofa, Derek Holt. The nightmare she thought she had escaped 2 years ago was sitting in her living room, a half-burned cigarette on his lips and a nearly empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. He looked worse than the last time she had seen him, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, and an untrimmed beard covering half the face she had once loved. "Hello, sweetheart," Derek said, his words drawn out and slightly slurred with drink. "Miss me?" Isla stood frozen in the doorway, every instinct in her body screaming at her to run. Memories crashed over her like a tidal wave. The nights he came home drunk and took his rage out on her. The bruises she hid beneath thick layers of makeup, the tearful apologies the next morning that she had foolishly believed. She had lost 2 years of her life escaping Derek Holt. 2 years of hell she thought had ended when she finally found the courage to leave. "What are you doing here?" Isla asked, forcing her voice to stay steady while she trembled inside. "How did you know where I live?" Derek laughed, a dry sound without any humor. "I've always known where you are, Isla. Did you really think you could hide from me?" He stood up, and Isla realized he seemed taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had just forgotten what it felt like to be threatened by his size and strength. "I need money," Derek said bluntly. "I owe some dangerous people, very dangerous people, and they're coming to collect." "I don't have money," Isla said, and it was the truth. Every dollar she earned went toward Maisie's hospital bills and the mountain of debt her father had left behind. Derek stepped closer, and Isla backed up until her spine hit the closed door behind her. "I don't care," Derek said, his voice turning cold and sharp. "You'll find a way to get it for me. You're smart, aren't you? Always thought you were better than me." He lifted his hand, and Isla flinched on instinct, but he only brushed a strand of hair away from her face, a gesture that almost seemed gentle while carrying a silent threat. "I know about Maisie," Derek said, and Isla felt her heart constrict. "Your poor little sister, lying in the hospital with a broken heart. It'd be a real shame if something happened to her, wouldn't it?" "Don't you dare touch my sister," Isla said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "Then help me," Derek replied simply. "Get the money for me, somehow. I don't care how you do it. I just need $200,000 within a month." $200,000? Isla almost laughed at the absurdity. "You're insane. I can't get that kind of money." "Then you'd better start figuring it out," Derek said, stepping back and picking up the whiskey bottle. "Because if I don't pay them, they'll kill me. And before I die, I'll make sure you and your sister go with me." He walked past her, opened the door, and vanished into the night, leaving Isla shaking in the dark of her apartment. Pretzel slowly crawled out from under the bed, let out a weak meow, and pressed against her legs. Isla sank to the floor, pulling the cat into her arms as tears streamed down her face. She had thought she was free of Derek, thought she had built a new life no matter how fragile it was, but the ghost of her past had found her. And this time it threatened not only her but Maisie, the only person she loved without condition. In the darkness, Isla thought of the card in her pocket, of the man with gray eyes and limitless power. "Dinner, Saturday. Maybe it was time for her to learn who her enemy really was, and more importantly, whether that enemy could become an ally. Saturday arrived faster than Isla had hoped. She stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, wearing the same burgundy silk dress Tessa had lent her, wondering what she was doing. Going to dinner with a Mafia boss, with a killer, with a man whose mere gaze was enough to silence an entire room. But after the night Derek appeared, after the threats about Maisie, Isla realized she needed to know more about the world she was being pulled into without her consent. And Raphael Corsetti, no matter how dangerous he was, seemed to be the only one who could give her answers. Exactly at 8 o'clock, a sleek black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of her aging building, and Isla knew he had arrived. She took a deep breath, stroked Pretzel one last time, and stepped outside. The driver opened the door, and Isla slid into the back seat, where Raphael was waiting in his familiar black suit, gray eyes sweeping over her with undisguised appraisal. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low. "I know," Isla replied, not letting him see how fast her heart was beating. Raphael gave a soft chuckle, a rare sound Isla was beginning to recognize as a sign that she had amused him. The car rolled through the streets of Manhattan, and Isla watched the city through the window, trying to guess where they were headed. She didn't ask, and Raphael didn't offer. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable, as if they were both weighing their next move. Finally, the car stopped in front of a tall building on the Upper East Side, and Raphael led her into a private elevator up to the rooftop. The restaurant, if it could even be called that, was an isolated space, with a single table, flickering candles, and a sweeping view of the city stretching beneath them. There were no other diners, no visible staff, just the two of them and the New York night sky. "You rented out the whole place?" Isla asked as she sat in the chair. Raphael pulled out for her. "I own it," Raphael replied simply, as if owning a rooftop restaurant in Manhattan was an ordinary thing. Dinner began with dishes Isla couldn't pronounce, each one delicate and undoubtedly costing more than her weekly wages. Raphael asked her questions about her work, her life, what she wanted, and Isla answered with evasive, sharp remarks. She didn't trust him and didn't want to give him any more weapons to use against her. Then Raphael set his glass down and looked straight at her, his expression serious. "You don't need to hide," he said. "I already know everything." Isla stiffened. "What do you know?" "I know your father left when you were 18 and abandoned $150,000 in debt. I know your mother died of cancer when you were 15. I know your sister Maisie, 22 years old, is in Mount Sinai Hospital with a congenital heart condition and needs surgery that costs $200,000. And I know about Derek Holt." At the sound of that name, Isla felt the blood in her veins turn cold. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You have no right to dig through my life like that." "I have every right," Raphael replied, his voice unmoved. "When someone steps into my world, I need to know who they are. I need to know whether they're a threat, an enemy sent to me, or just a girl who sat in the wrong place at a party." "I didn't step into your world," Isla said, rising from her chair, ready to leave. "I'm just trying to survive." Raphael stood as well, and in a single step he was in front of her, blocking her path. "Sit down," he said, his tone gentle but unmistakably a command. "There's something I need to tell you." Something in his voice made Isla stop. She looked into those gray eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Not a threat, but something close to a warning. She sat back down, and Raphael took the seat across from her, closer than before. "Derek Holt owes me money," Raphael said. $200,000. From gambling and loans he was never capable of repaying. Isla felt the ground fall away beneath her. Derek owed Raphael Corsetti money. The number matched exactly what Derek had demanded from her. But that wasn't the worst part, Raphael continued, his voice dropping lower. When Derek couldn't pay, he offered something else as collateral. "You, Isla." She sat there, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to believe what she had just heard. Derek, the man who had once claimed to love her, had sold her like property to settle his debt. Nausea rose in her throat as the world spun around her. "I'm not something that can be sold," she said, her voice shaking but filled with fury. "I know," Raphael said, and for the first time his voice held something almost gentle. "That's why I wanted to meet you. Not to collect a debt, not to own you the way Derek thought, but to tell you the truth, and to offer you a choice." The car drove Isla back to her apartment in silence. She sat beside Raphael without looking at him, her eyes fixed on the city lights sliding past the window. When the car stopped, Raphael took her hand, gently but firmly. "Think about what I've said," he told her. "I'll come for you tomorrow, and we'll talk about that choice." Isla stepped out of the car without a word, but she knew her life had changed once again. Derek had sold her to the devil, and now the devil was standing at her door, not demanding her soul, but offering her a deal. Isla didn't sleep that night. She lay on her bed, eyes wide open, staring at the peeling ceiling, feeling as if the entire world she knew had collapsed. Derek had sold her, the man who once said he loved her, who promised he'd change, who made her believe the bruises were accidents, had turned her into collateral to cover his gambling debt. She didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that she wasn't surprised at all. Somewhere deep inside, she had always known what kind of man Derek was. Pretzel curled up beside her, the cat's warmth the only thing anchoring her to reality. Then morning came. Isla dragged herself out of bed, brewed a cup of bitter black coffee, and waited. She knew Raphael would come. He'd said he would, and she'd learned that Raphael Corsetti kept his word. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a knock on the door, and when Isla opened it, he was standing there, not in his usual black suit of power, but in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and black trousers, looking almost ordinary if not for the icy gray eyes and the scar on his cheek. He glanced around her small apartment without judgment, simply observing. Then his gaze settled on Pretzel, sitting on the bed, watching him warily. "Your cat?" Raphael asked. "Pretzel," Isla replied. "He doesn't like strangers." Raphael didn't comment. He sat down on the only chair in the room and looked at her expectantly. Isla leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed over her chest like a shield. "You said you had a choice for me," she said, her voice hard as steel. "Say it." Raphael nodded and went straight to the point. "I'll erase Derek's debt, all $200,000. He won't owe me anything anymore. And more importantly, he won't have any reason to come near you again." "And in return," Isla asked, because she knew nothing in this world was free. "You stay with me for 3 months," Raphael said. "You live in my penthouse. Appear with me when necessary. Give me the chance to know you. That's all." Isla laughed, a bitter sound. "You want to buy me, just like Derek thought he could sell me. I'm a commodity to you men, aren't I?" "No." Raphael stood and stepped closer, stopping 1 pace away, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body but not close enough to threaten her. "I'm not buying you. I'm offering a deal. You give me time, and I give you freedom from Derek along with the money for Maisie's surgery." Isla froze. "The money for Maisie's surgery? $200,000 for the operation," Raphael said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll pay all of it. Your sister will have the surgery with the best doctors, in the best hospital. You won't have to worry about money anymore." "Why?" Isla whispered. "Why would you do all this for a woman you don't even know?" Raphael was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was different, softer, more real. "Because you looked at me like I was just a man, not a mafia boss, not a killer, not something to fear. You looked at me, and you saw me. That's rarer than you think." Isla didn't know what to say. She thought of Maisie lying in the hospital, thought of her sister's eyes every time Isla visited, trying to look brave while failing to hide the fear of a future that might never come. She thought of the debts, the sleepless nights, the years she'd spent fighting alone. Then she thought of the man standing in front of her, dangerous and enigmatic, offering her a way out. "I have conditions," Isla said at last. "Go on. First, no one touches Maisie. My sister has nothing to do with your world, and I want it to stay that way." "Agreed," Raphael said immediately. "Second, I keep my job. I don't want to become completely dependent on you." "Agreed." "Third, no one knows about this arrangement. To the outside world, I'm just someone you know, not something bought with money." "Agreed." "And fourth," Isla met his eyes directly, "if at any point I feel unsafe or want to leave, you let me go. No drama, no threats, no retaliation. You let me go and we act as if we never knew each other." Raphael studied her, his gray eyes unreadable. The silence stretched, and Isla braced herself for refusal. Then he nodded. "Agreed. All 4 conditions. Anything else?" Isla shook her head, feeling as if she'd just survived a battle without knowing whether she'd won or lost. Raphael handed her a document, a contract printed with all the terms they'd just discussed. She read every line carefully, searching for traps, for fine print that could destroy her. There was none. The contract was simple and direct, exactly as he'd said. Isla took the pen and signed her name, and as she set it down, she felt as if she'd just sold her soul to the devil. But if the devil could save Maisie, she was willing to pay any price. 1 week later, Isla stood in the middle of Raphael Corsetti's penthouse and felt as if she had stepped into an entirely different dimension. The apartment occupied the entire top floor of a building on the Upper West Side, so vast that Isla was certain it was larger than the entire building she had once lived in back in Queens. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed a sweeping view of Central Park below, stretched out like an enormous green carpet, and the interior was designed with a kind of restrained, commanding minimalism, all black, gray, and white, with not a single unnecessary object in sight. "This is your home for the next 3 months, Raphael said, standing beside her and watching her reaction. "You can use anything here. Your bedroom is at the end of the hall on the right, far enough from mine so you'll have your own space." Isla nodded, unsure what to say. She had kept her old apartment, partly because Pretzel was used to it, and partly because she needed to know she had somewhere to return to if everything fell apart. Raphael didn't object. He even paid 6 months of her rent in advance without her having to ask. The first days passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. Isla didn't know how she was supposed to behave in this place. Didn't know whether she was a guest or a prisoner, an acquaintance or something that had been bought. Raphael was absent most of the time. Leaving for work Isla didn't ask about and he didn't explain. Then one afternoon, as Isla was sitting by the window reading, the penthouse door swung open and a younger man walked in, with black hair like Raphael's but a completely different smile, bright and disarming. "So you're the mysterious girl my brother's been hiding," the man said, walking over and holding out his hand. "I'm Theo, Raphael's younger brother, or as I like to call it, the cuter version of the Corsetti family." Isla shook his hand, unable to stop herself from smiling at Theo's effortless warmth. "I'm Isla," she said. "I know," Theo replied, dropping into the chair across from her as if they were old friends. "My brother's talked about you. Well, actually, he hasn't said a word, which is what makes it interesting. Raphael never lets anyone stay here, you know. Not once. And then you show up, and suddenly he's got a roommate. I'm dying of curiosity." Isla didn't know how to respond, but fortunately Raphael appeared just then, and the look he gave Theo was enough for his brother to raise his hands in surrender and disappear in a burst of laughter. But Theo's appearance wasn't the only thing Isla witnessed during those first days. One night, she woke to sounds coming from Raphael's study, and, driven by curiosity, moved toward it. The door was slightly open, and through the crack Isla saw a scene that made her blood run cold. Raphael was standing in front of a man tied to a chair, the man's face swollen and covered in blood. "You betrayed me," Raphael said, his voice cold as ice. "You thought I wouldn't find out." Then Raphael swung his arm, and Isla heard the unmistakable sound of bone breaking, followed by the man's scream of pain. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding like a war drum, and ran back to her room. She lay on her bed, trembling, wondering what kind of world she had stepped into. But in the days that followed, she saw other things too. She saw Raphael sitting on the floor playing with an old dog, a golden retriever he called Bruno, stroking the animal with a gentleness she hadn't thought he was capable of. She heard him call his mother every evening, his voice softening as he asked about her health, as he talked about his day, as he said, "I love you" before hanging up. Isla began to realize that Raphael Corsetti wasn't as one-dimensional as she had thought. He was a killer, but he was also a devoted son. He was ruthless with his enemies, yet tender with those he loved. He was darkness and light existing in the same body, and Isla didn't know whether that frightened her more or made her more curious. 2 weeks after moving into the penthouse, Raphael suggested taking Isla to visit Maisie. She was surprised by the offer, because she had tried to keep the two worlds separate, Raphael's world and her sister's world. But Raphael said he wanted to meet the most important person in her life, and Isla couldn't find a reason to refuse. They arrived at Mount Sinai Hospital on a bright sunny afternoon, the sleek black Rolls-Royce stopping at the entrance and drawing more than a few curious glances. Isla stepped out of the car with Raphael beside her, and it felt strange walking next to him in his expensive suit through hospital corridors. She had walked hundreds of times in worn-out clothes. When they opened the door to the room, Maisie was sitting on the bed reading, her brown hair like Isla's tied loosely back, her face pale but her eyes still bright. Her sister looked up, eyes widening when she saw Isla enter with a strange man. "Isla?" Maisie said, her voice filled with surprise. And who is this? Isla swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. This is a friend of mine, she said, hoping her voice sounded normal. He's helping me with a few things. Raphael stepped closer to the bed, and Isla watched him carefully, ready to intervene if he said anything inappropriate. But what happened next caught her completely off guard. Raphael pulled a chair closer and sat down, the smile on his lips softer than any Isla had ever seen from him. Maisie, he said, I've heard so much about you from your sister. I hear you like reading. Maisie nodded, her initial shyness fading under the unexpected warmth of the man in front of her. Yes, I'm rereading the Harry Potter series. I know it's a bit childish, but I like escaping reality sometimes. There's nothing childish about that, Raphael said. I've read it 3 times. Slytherin, in case you're wondering. Maisie laughed, a clear, bright sound Isla hadn't heard in a long time. Isla is Gryffindor, Maisie said, always brave and stubborn. I'm not surprised, Raphael said, glancing at Isla with a look she couldn't quite decipher. They talked for nearly an hour, about books, about movies, about ordinary things. Isla had forgotten what it felt like to talk about. Raphael listened as Maisie spoke about her dream of becoming a writer, about the stories she wanted to write once she was well. And he listened truly, not with the polite detachment Isla was used to seeing in wealthy men at Noir. When they left, Maisie squeezed Isla's hand and whispered, He looks at you like you're his whole world. Do you know that? Isla didn't answer. She just kissed her sister's forehead and promised she'd be back soon. But once they stepped into the elevator, once the doors closed and it was only her and Raphael in that small space, everything Isla had been holding back finally broke free. She cried. For the first time in years, she cried for real. Not the quiet tears she shed alone at night, but sobs she couldn't control. She cried for little Maisie fighting a cruel illness, for how tired she was of carrying everything alone for so many years, for the fear that no matter how hard she tried, it might never be enough. Memories crashed over her like a wave. Images of Isla and Maisie as children, when their mother was still alive, when their family was a home and not a pile of ruins. Their mother had once said Isla was the strongest sister in the world, and Isla had tried to live up to that. But sometimes she forgot that even the strongest people are allowed to break. She's all I have left, Isla whispered through her sobs, not knowing whether she was speaking to Raphael or to herself. If I lose her, I don't know what I'll do. Raphael didn't speak. He didn't offer hollow comfort or promises he couldn't guarantee. He simply reached out and took her hand, warm and steady, anchoring her to the present while everything else spun. Let me help you hold on to that, Raphael said at last, his voice low and sincere. You don't have to fight alone anymore. Isla looked up, eyes red and filled with tears, and she saw something in Raphael's gaze she hadn't expected from a Mafia boss. Understanding. Maybe he knew what loss felt like too. Knew what it meant to fight to keep the people you loved. When they returned to the penthouse, Raphael told her that Maisie's surgery had been scheduled for 2 weeks later, with the best cardiac surgeons in the country. Isla wanted to say thank you, but words didn't seem enough, so she simply nodded and hoped he understood. 1 week before Maisie's surgery, Raphael told Isla that he wanted to take her to meet his mother. Isla nearly dropped the coffee cup in her hand. Meet your mother, she asked, unable to hide her surprise. Why? Because she wants to meet you, Raphael replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I never say no to my mother. They drove to a villa on Long Island, where Carmela Corsetti had lived alone since her husband passed away more than 10 years earlier. The house wasn't as grand as Isla had imagined, but it carried a quiet, classical elegance, with stone walls and a rose garden tended with meticulous care. When they stepped inside, a petite woman with silver hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck was waiting by the door. She wore a simple navy blue dress that was understated yet refined, and her eyes, the same gray as Raphael's, were so sharp that Isla felt seen straight through from the very first moment. So this is the girl Raphael told me about, Carmela said, her voice warm yet weighted with the authority of someone who had lived through many storms. More beautiful than I expected. Isla felt heat rush to her cheeks. Thank you, she said, unsure how she was supposed to address her. Carmela waved a hand and drew Isla into the house, while Raphael followed with a rare smile on his lips. Lunch was served in the garden, gentle sunlight filtering through the leaves and scattering soft patterns across the table. Carmela asked Isla about her life, her work, her family, and Isla found she couldn't lie to this woman. There was something about Carmela that invited honesty, perhaps eyes that had seen too much to be deceived, or perhaps the genuine warmth hidden beneath her aristocratic exterior. Isla spoke of her mother's death, her father leaving, of Maisie and her heart condition, of the years spent struggling simply to survive. Carmela listened without interrupting, and when Isla finished, she only nodded and said, "You are a strong woman. My son knows how to choose." After lunch, Raphael was called away to take a phone call, and Carmela led Isla into the garden for a walk, just the two women among blooming roses. "I want to tell you something," Carmela said, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "Raphael has never brought anyone here. Never. Over the years, I have watched him build walls around himself, higher and thicker with every passing day. He believes he doesn't deserve love because of what he has had to do to protect this family." Isla stayed silent, not knowing what to say. Carmela stopped and turned to her, gray eyes holding both sorrow and hope. "Then you appeared, and I saw something change in my son. He smiles more. He comes home earlier, and for the first time in many years, he talks about the future as if he truly wants one." Carmela took Isla's hand, small but warm. "Be careful with his heart, my dear," she said, almost pleading. "On the outside he is steel and stone, but inside, his heart is far more fragile than he lets anyone see. If you hurt him, I fear he will never allow anyone close again." When Isla and Raphael left, Carmela hugged her tightly, as if she were already part of the family. On the drive back, Isla looked at Raphael, focused on the road ahead, and wondered how many layers he wore like armor, and whether she was brave enough to peel them away one by one. A month had passed since Isla moved into the penthouse, and she was surprised to realize she was beginning to grow used to this life. Not the luxury, not the expensive clothes Raphael bought for her even though she never asked, but the strange rhythm that had formed between the two of them. Every morning, Isla woke up and made coffee for both of them, and Raphael would sit at the dining table, reading the news on his tablet with a serious expression, as if the world were about to collapse. Isla would tease him about it, saying that if he frowned any harder, the scar on his face would get a companion, and Raphael would look at her with mock irritation, while the corner of his mouth betrayed his amusement. Isla began to realize she was waiting for those mornings, waiting for the sound of Raphael's footsteps in the hallway, waiting for the way he sat across from her and asked if she had slept well, even though he knew the answer was always no. What surprised her even more was that Raphael was changing too. He started coming home earlier, seeking her out to talk instead of locking himself in his study until late. He asked about her day, about Maisie, about the books she was reading, and he listened as if her answers were the most important things in the world. That night, 3 days before Maisie's surgery, Isla couldn't sleep. She sat on the penthouse balcony, looking down at the city that never slept, trying not to think about the thousands of things that could go wrong in the operating room. She didn't hear his footsteps, but she felt Raphael's presence when he sat beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low in the quiet night. Isla shook her head. "I keep thinking about everything that could happen, about what if the surgery fails? What if I lose Maisie? What if I end up alone again?" Raphael was silent for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice carried something distant and painful. "I know that feeling. The fear of losing the people you love." Isla turned to look at him, and in the city lights, she saw Raphael's gray eyes staring into nothing, as if he were seeing something from the past. "My father was assassinated when I was 19, Raphael said, and Isla held her breath, knowing he was opening a door he kept closed to almost everyone, right in front of me. We were having dinner at home, and then the glass shattered and his blood spilled across the floor. Raphael's voice didn't shake, but Isla felt the weight of every word. "I was 19, he continued, just a kid, but that night I had to pick up a gun for the first time in my life. I had to become the man my family needed, step into my father's shoes even though they were far too big. I had no choice. And from that moment on, I was never allowed to be weak again." Isla felt her chest tighten. She had seen Raphael as a mafia boss, a killer, a man who terrified an entire city. Now she saw him as a 19-year-old boy who had lost his father and been thrown into a brutal world without warning. "I have scars too," Isla said, not knowing why she wanted to share this, only knowing that if he could open himself to her, she should do the same. She turned her back and lifted her shirt slightly, revealing the faint scars running down her spine, remnants of Derek's beatings that time had faded but never fully erased. "Derek," she said, the name tasting like bitter honey on her tongue. "He beat me for 2 years. Every time he drank, every time he was angry, every time he felt the world had treated him unfairly. And I stayed, because I thought it was love, because I thought I deserved it." She felt Raphael's hand rest gently against her back, his fingers tracing the scars with a tenderness she hadn't believed he possessed. She turned to face him, and in his eyes she saw a burning fury, not directed at her, but at the man who had hurt her. "You think you're a monster," Isla said, her voice soft but steady. "But you're not. The real monsters are the ones who hurt those who can't defend themselves. Men like Derek, who beat women weaker than them and call it love. You can be ruthless, but you never hurt the innocent." Raphael looked at her, and something broke in those gray eyes, a wall collapsing, a layer of armor falling away. "You're not afraid of the darkness in me?" he asked, his voice rough. "I've lived in darkness long enough to know it's not as frightening as loneliness," Isla replied. Then Raphael kissed her. Not a demanding or possessive kiss like she might have expected from a Mafia boss, but a slow, gentle kiss, as if he were asking permission, as if he were afraid she would disappear if he moved too fast. Isla kissed him back, and she knew it wasn't because of the agreement, not because of obligation, not because she needed him. She kissed him because she wanted to, because for the first time in a very long while, she felt seen, understood, and accepted with all her scars and sharp edges. When they pulled apart, foreheads touching, Raphael whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you ever again." And Isla believed him. 2 days after that kiss, Isla decided to return to her old apartment to pick up more things for Pretzel. The cat had officially moved into the penthouse after Raphael said he didn't want her running back and forth between 2 places, and Isla needed to get more of the special food Pretzel liked along with a few of his old toys. Raphael offered to send someone with her, but Isla refused, saying she would only be gone briefly and would be right back. She didn't want to become a woman who needed protection at every moment, didn't want to lose the independence she had fought so hard to keep. Looking back, it was the biggest mistake she had ever made. The apartment was silent and dark when Isla opened the door and stepped inside, the air stale with the damp smell of a place that hadn't been lived in for weeks. She turned on the light and began gathering things, stuffing them into a large bag. She was bent over, reaching under the bed for the stuffed mouse toy Pretzel loved, when she heard the door slam shut behind her. Isla sprang upright, her blood turning cold, as she saw Derek standing between her and the only exit. He looked far worse than the last time, eyes bloodshot, beard unkempt, clothes wrinkled and reeking of alcohol. But what terrified Isla wasn't his appearance. It was the crazed look in his eyes, staring at her as if she were an enemy that needed to be destroyed. "You think you can leave me and run to that Corsetti bastard?" Derek roared, his voice twisted with drink and rage. "I know everything, Isla. You're living with him, sleeping with him, betraying me with my enemy." "I didn't betray anyone," Isla said, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart hammered. "We broke up 2 years ago, Derek. You don't have any right to me anymore." "Wrong," Derek screamed, lunging at her. "You belong to me. You've always belonged to me." Isla tried to run, but the apartment was too small and Derek was too fast. He grabbed her by the hair and yanked hard, slamming her to the floor. Pain tore through her scalp, but Isla didn't cry or beg. She had learned long ago that tears and pleas only excited Derek more. "You're mine," Derek shouted in her face, slapping her so hard her ears rang. "I sold you to Corsetti, yes, but I had no choice. I'll take you back. I'll kill him and take you back." Isla tasted blood in her mouth, her lips split from the blow, but the anger rising inside her was stronger than the pain. She swung her hand up and raked her nails across Derek's face, leaving 4 red gashes from his forehead down his cheek. Derek screamed in pain and shock, releasing her for a second. Isla used that moment to try to crawl away, but Derek recovered too quickly. He kicked her in the stomach, folding her over with a cry of pain. "You bitch," Derek snarled, raising his fist to strike again. Isla squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the next blow. It never came. Instead, she heard the door burst open, shouts, the sound of bodies colliding, and when she opened her eyes, 2 large men were pinning Derek to the floor and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Isla recognized them as Raphael's men, the guards he had secretly assigned to follow her even though she said she didn't need them. Derek was dragged away, still screaming and cursing, and Isla collapsed onto the floor, blood from her lip dripping onto her white shirt. The phone in her pocket vibrated, and when she looked at the screen, Raphael's name filled it. She answered with trembling hands. "I'm coming," Raphael's voice said, low and thick with restrained fury. "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming." Raphael arrived within 15 minutes, and when he stepped through the apartment door, Isla saw a version of him she had never witnessed before. The gray eyes that were usually cold and controlled were now dark as a gathering storm. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitch beneath his skin, and his entire presence radiated a black, suffocating energy that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. He dropped to his knees in front of Isla, and his hands trembled as they touched her face, gently turning her head to examine her injuries. Her lip had stopped bleeding but was still swollen, and a bruise was already blooming on her cheek where Derek had struck her. With every wound, Raphael discovered, the fury in his eyes burned hotter, yet his touch remained careful and tender, as if she were something fragile that could shatter at any moment. "Where is he?" Raphael asked, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a caged animal. One of his men stepped forward and said they had taken him to the warehouse. "Sir." Raphael nodded and stood, his body taut as a drawn wire, ready for violence. He turned back to Isla one last time, and in that instant she saw not only rage but pain, as if her injuries had wounded him just as deeply. "Wait here," he said, his voice softening slightly when he spoke to her. "I'll be back." Isla knew where he was going and what he intended to do. She had seen Raphael torture a traitor in the penthouse, had witnessed the cruelty he was capable of unleashing, and a part of her, the part that had been beaten and humiliated by Derek for 2 years, wanted Raphael to do whatever he pleased to that bastard. But another part of her, the part her mother had raised with care, knew that if Raphael killed Derek because of her, she would have to carry that weight for the rest of her life. "Wait," Isla said, forcing herself to stand even though her stomach still ached from Derek's kick. Raphael stopped at the door and turned back to her. "Don't kill him." Raphael's eyes darkened. "Give me one reason." "Because if you kill him," Isla said, stepping closer and taking his hand, "I'll have to live with that. Every time I look at you, I'll remember that someone died because of me, and I don't want that. I don't want you to become a monster for me." "He hurt you," Raphael said, his voice shaking with restraint. "He beat you, threatened you, sold you like property. He deserves to die." "Maybe he does." Isla nodded. "But that isn't our decision. I escaped Derek. I survived, and I'm standing here with you. That's my victory. Don't take that away by turning it into a killing." Raphael looked at her, and Isla could see the battle raging inside him. Part of him wanted to tear Derek apart for daring to touch her, wanted to send a message to anyone who thought they could harm what belonged to him. But another part, the part she had slowly uncovered over the past weeks, was listening to her. The silence stretched, and then Raphael exhaled, a heavy breath as if he were setting down an impossible weight. "All right," he said at last. "I won't kill him. For you." "Thank you," Isla whispered. "But don't think he'll walk away without paying," Raphael said, his voice turning cold once more. "He'll remember tonight every time he tries to walk." He bent down and pressed a kiss to Isla's forehead, a gentle gesture that stood in stark contrast to the brutality he was about to unleash. Then he walked out the door, and Isla knew that Derek Holt would not die that night, but he would never be the same again, and she found that she didn't feel guilty about that at all. Raphael returned to the penthouse near dawn, and Isla didn't ask what he had done to Derek. She didn't need to ask. She only needed to know that Derek was still alive, and that was enough. But when Raphael sat down beside her on the sofa, his face more drawn and exhausted than she had ever seen it, she knew something else was wrong. "What is it?" Isla asked, resting her hand on his arm. Raphael stayed silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much of the truth he should give her. Then he sighed and met her eyes. "Derek didn't just owe me money," he said, his voice low and heavy. "He sold information about me to Victor Santini." "Santini?" Isla repeated, the name unfamiliar, but the way Raphael said it told her everything she needed to know. "The boss of the Santini family," Raphael explained. "One of my family's greatest enemies. He's wanted Corsetti territory for years, and now, thanks to Derek, he has what he needs to plan an attack." A chill ran down Isla's spine. She had known Raphael's world was dangerous, but hearing about an approaching Mafia war was something else entirely. "What does that mean?" she asked, even though she was afraid of the answer. "It means war is coming," Raphael said, his voice hardening. "And it means you're in danger. Santini knows about you, Isla. He knows you matter to me, and in our world, that makes you a target." Isla swallowed, feeling as if an invisible hand had tightened around her throat. She had entered this life because of a deal, because of Maisie's surgery, because she wanted to escape Derek. She had never imagined she would become a piece on the board in a war between crime families. "I need you to leave New York," Raphael said, taking her hand. I have a house in Vermont, safe and secluded. You can stay there until this is over. And Maisie? Isla asked immediately. Her surgery is the day after tomorrow. She'll be protected, Raphael promised. I'll have guards at the hospital 24 hours a day. But you need to go. Isla, if Santini gets his hands on you, he'll use you against me, and I can't bear that. Isla looked into the gray eyes fixed on her with real concern, and she made her choice. No, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm not running anymore. Isla, Raphael started, but she cut him off. I've been running my whole life, Isla said, running from my father, running from Derek, running from every hard thing that came my way, and I'm tired. I don't want to run anymore. I want to stand and fight, whether that's beside you or in whatever way I can. Do you know what you're saying? Raphael asked, and Isla saw something strange in his eyes, something that looked like fear. This is real war. People will die. I know, Isla nodded, but I can't leave you alone in this. Not now. Not after everything that's happened between us. Raphael studied her for a long moment, and then she saw something she hadn't expected in those usually icy gray eyes. Real fear. Not of Santini, not of war, but of losing her. I can't lose you, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I've lost too many people in my life. My father, my friends, everyone I cared about. I can't add you to that list. Isla, I can't. Isla lifted her hand to his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. Then don't lose me, she said. Fight and win, and keep me by your side. And that was exactly what Raphael intended to do. The day of Maisie's surgery arrived, and Isla woke with the feeling that a heavy stone was pressing down on her chest. She hadn't slept at all through the night, lying on her back and staring at the ceiling, praying to any god who might be listening that her sister would survive. Raphael had stayed with her the entire night, saying nothing, simply holding her hand in the darkness, and his presence was the only thing keeping her from breaking apart. They arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Manhattan skyline. Maisie was already prepared, lying on the bed in a pale blue hospital gown, her face drawn and tired but her smile as bright as ever. I'm going to be fine, Maisie said when Isla bent down to hug her. Don't worry about me. I'm strong. Isla tried not to cry, tried to smile for her sister. I know you're strong. You're the strongest girl I know. But I'm still allowed to worry, right? Maisie laughed and glanced at Raphael standing beside the bed, tall and composed in his familiar black suit. Make sure you take care of my sister while I'm asleep, she said to him, her tone playful despite everything. She forgets to eat when she's worried. I won't leave her side for a second, Raphael promised, and Isla saw something like approval light up in her sister's eyes. The nurses came to wheel Maisie toward the operating room, and Isla watched until the doors closed, until her sister disappeared from sight. Then her legs seemed to give out, and if Raphael hadn't caught her, she would have collapsed to the floor. He guided her to the waiting room, a small space filled with hard chairs and cold fluorescent light, and they began to wait. The first hour passed in silence. Isla sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the operating room doors as if staring hard enough might make time move faster. Raphael sat beside her without speaking, one hand resting against her back as a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. During the second hour, Raphael's phone kept vibrating. Isla knew he had an important meeting that day, a meeting with the other families to discuss the threat from Santini, a meeting that could determine the future of the entire Corsetti empire. You should go, Isla said, her voice hoarse after hours of silence. The meeting matters. Raphael turned off his phone and slipped it into his pocket. Nothing matters more than being here with you. By the third hour, Isla couldn't sit still anymore and began pacing the room. She thought of everything that could go wrong. Maisie's heart being too weak, a mistake by the surgeons, some unforeseen complication. She imagined life without her sister, and the thought made her want to scream. During the fourth hour, Raphael insisted she eat a sandwich he'd bought from the hospital cafeteria. Isla felt no hunger at all, nothing but the anxiety gnawing at her from the inside. But she ate because she knew Maisie would scold her if she didn't. The fifth hour passed, then the sixth, then the seventh. Time moved like thick honey, slow and heavy. Isla could no longer cry or even worry properly. She felt numb, hollow, as if her soul had stepped outside her body to wait somewhere else. Then, in the eighth hour, the operating room doors opened and the surgeon stepped out, still in surgical scrubs, and Isla couldn't read his expression. Her heart stopped for 1 second, then 2, then 3. The surgery was a success, the doctor said, and Isla felt as though she'd been brought back to life. Your sister will need time to recover, but her new heart is strong and functioning well. She's going to be fine. Isla didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was in Raphael's arms, sobbing into his chest, and he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She's going to be fine, Raphael whispered into her hair. She's going to be fine. An hour later, they were allowed to see Maisie. Once she'd been moved from recovery to a regular room. She was still weak, her eyes closed from the anesthesia, but when she felt Isla's hand clasping hers, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. I made it, she whispered, her voice rough. See, I told you I was strong. Isla laughed through her tears and bent to kiss her sister's forehead. You're the bravest girl in the world. Maisie glanced at Raphael, standing by the bed, then back at Isla. So is he your friend? She asked, her smile mischievous despite her weakness. Isla looked at Raphael, the man who had stayed by her side for 8 endless hours, who had cancelled the most important meeting of the year to sit in a hard chair in a hospital waiting room, who had held her hand and given her strength when she thought she would fall apart. He hopes to be more than that, Raphael said, and there was a softness in his voice Isla had never heard before. Maisie smiled, then looked at Isla with eyes that shone even though her body was still so fragile. He looks at you like you're his whole world, she said. You deserve to be looked at that way, Isla. That night, after they returned to the penthouse, after Maisie had fallen into a deep sleep under the watch of nurses and guards, Isla stood on the balcony gazing out at the city and felt Raphael come to stand beside her. She turned to him, the man she'd met through a foolish coincidence in a game of musical chairs, the man she'd feared, doubted, and slowly learned to trust. I love you, Isla said, and the words left her lips more easily than she expected, as if they'd been waiting there for a long time. I know it sounds crazy. I know we've only known each other for a few months. I know you're dangerous, and your world is complicated, but I love you. I love the way you look at me, the way you take care of me, the way you stayed with me for 8 hours today without a single complaint. I love you, Raphael Corsetti, even if I don't know what that means in our world. Raphael looked at her, and Isla saw something she never thought she'd see in the cold, powerful Mafia boss, tears gathering in his gray eyes. I love you too, he said, his voice trembling as if he'd never spoken those words to anyone before. I love you so much it scares me. And he kissed her beneath the lights of Manhattan, and Isla knew that no matter the storms ahead, no matter Santini waiting in the shadows, no matter the world threatening to collapse around them, she had found her home in this man's arms. 2 weeks after the surgery, when Maisie had recovered enough to be moved out of intensive care into a regular room and had begun learning how to walk again, the war with Santini erupted. Isla was sitting beside Maisie's hospital bed, reading to her, when her phone vibrated with a message from Raphael containing only 3 words, "Come back to the penthouse now." She had never seen Raphael text like that before, and her instincts told her something very bad had happened. She kissed Maisie's forehead, promised she would be back soon, and rushed out of the hospital. The moment Isla stepped into the penthouse, she knew her intuition had been right. The apartment was crowded with people, men in black suits with tense faces talking urgently on their phones, typing at computers, pointing at maps spread across the table. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks, and at the center of it all stood Raphael with his back to her, his shoulders rigid as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world. What happened? Isla asked, and when Raphael turned around, she saw that his face was drained of color, his gray eyes dark as a moonless night. Santini took Theo, Raphael said, his voice raw as if he had been shouting until his throat tore. His men attacked one of our warehouses this morning. Theo was there checking inventory. They killed 4 of my men and took my brother. Isla felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. She thought of Theo, the warm, easygoing man who had welcomed her into the Corsetti family like an old friend, who had teased Raphael about finally having a woman in his life. And now he was in enemy hands. What does Santini want? Isla asked, stepping closer to Raphael. He wants me to hand over all of Eastern Manhattan, Raphael said, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. If I don't, he'll send Theo back to me piece by piece. Isla felt sick. She had always known Raphael's world was brutal, but hearing it spoken aloud and standing inside it were 2 very different things. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to get my brother back, Raphael said, his voice hard as steel. Even if I have to burn this city to the ground. But we don't know where Santini is holding Theo. One of the men spoke up, his face etched with worry. He has dozens of locations across the city. We can't check every one. If we guess wrong, Theo will die. Raphael let out a roar of frustration and turned away, his arm sweeping everything off the table in a violent burst of rage. Isla stood still, watching him, her mind racing. Santini, the name felt familiar. She had heard it before, not from Raphael, but somewhere else. And then the memory struck like lightning. Derek. Derek had mentioned Santini when he was drunk in her apartment weeks earlier. He had talked about dangerous people he owed money to, about places where they met, about locations he rambled on about because alcohol had loosened his tongue. Isla hadn't paid attention then because she'd been too frightened. But now she remembered, every fragment clicking into place. I know where Santini is, Isla said, her voice loud enough to cut through the noise in the room. Everyone turned toward her, and Raphael moved in front of her, his eyes lighting with hope. What did you say? Derek, Isla explained quickly. When he came to my apartment the first time, he was drunk and talked too much. He mentioned Santini, said he met Santini's people at an abandoned factory in Brooklyn, near the Williamsburg Bridge. He said it was where they handled sensitive matters, where no one could hear anyone scream. Are you sure? Raphael asked, gripping her shoulders. Isla nodded. I remember clearly because he said it like he was threatening me. An old steel factory, abandoned since the 1990s. Raphael looked at her as if she had just handed him the key to his brother's life. He bent down and kissed her, quick and fierce, then turned to his men and began issuing orders. Check that location immediately. Prep a strike team. We move in 1 hour. The room exploded into motion, people rushing back and forth, phones ringing, weapons being checked. Raphael turned back to Isla one last time before leaving. Stay here, he said, not as a command but as a plea. Don't go anywhere. I'll come back to you. Isla nodded and watched the man she loved walk into the darkness to fight for his brother. She knew he might not return. She knew tonight could be the last night, but she also knew she had given him the best chance possible, and that was all she could do. So she stood there in the penthouse, now eerily quiet, and prayed for the first time in many years that the man she loved would come back safely. Isla didn't know how much time had passed. She sat on the sofa in the silent penthouse, counting every minute, every second, praying to any god willing to listen. Pretzel curled up beside her as if the cat could sense her fear, and Isla stroked the soft orange fur just to keep her hands from shaking. She thought about Raphael fighting somewhere out there, about Theo being held captive, about everything that could go wrong. She thought about losing him, and the thought made her want to scream. Her phone stayed silent. No messages, no calls, nothing at all. That silence felt worse than any bad news, because it let her imagination run wild with every horrifying outcome she could picture. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. Isla began pacing the room like a caged animal, wondering if this was what women in this world endured every night, waiting to see whether their men would come home alive. Then, sometime around 3 in the morning, when Isla was nearly exhausted from fear, the penthouse door flew open. She saw Raphael step inside, and her heart shattered with relief and clenched with terror all at once. He was alive. He was home, but his white shirt was soaked in blood, one shoulder hastily bandaged, his face pale as if he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Theo came in right behind his brother, looking battered with bruises on his face, and marks from restraint still visible on his wrists, but alive. Isla didn't think. She just moved. She ran to Raphael and wrapped her arms around him, not caring about the blood seeping into her clothes, not caring about anything except that he was here, breathing, alive. I was so scared. She whispered into his chest, tears streaming down her face. Raphael held her with his uninjured arm, his lips pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I'm home. I promised you. They did it, Theo said, his voice rough but carrying something close to relief. Santini is dead. My brother killed him himself. The war is over. Isla looked up at Raphael and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also relief. The threat was gone. His brother was safe. The Corsetti family still stood, but the price was written clearly in the bleeding wound on his shoulder. You were shot, Isla said, worry flooding her as she reached to examine him. You need a hospital. It's just a graze, Raphael said, though he winced when she touched near the wound. It's nothing serious. Isla didn't believe him, but she also knew Raphael wouldn't go to a hospital no matter what she said, so she did the only thing she could. She led him into the bathroom, carefully removed his blood-stained shirt, and began cleaning and rebandaging the wound with the medical supplies she found in the cabinet. She wasn't a nurse, but she had learned how to tend injuries during the years Derek abused her, and she worked slowly and gently. When she finished, Raphael took her hand and held it tightly. 3 months, he said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. Today is the last day of the 3 months. Isla froze. She had forgotten in the chaos of the past weeks, forgotten that their agreement had an end date. She looked into the gray eyes, watching her with an emotion she couldn't fully read. "You're free," Raphael said, and there was pain in his voice. "Derek's debt is gone. Maisie has had her surgery. Our agreement is complete. You can leave whenever you want." "Do you want me to leave?" Isla asked softly. Raphael looked at her, and for the first time, she saw real fear in the eyes of the most powerful man in New York. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want you to stay forever, but it has to be your choice. Not because of a deal, not because of obligation. You deserve to choose, Isla, and I'll respect whatever you decide." Isla looked at him, the man who had changed her life from the night she accidentally sat on his lap, and she knew her answer. But she needed time to think, needed space to be sure this was what she wanted, not just what she needed. "I need 1 day," she said, "to think." Raphael nodded, and she saw a flash of pain in his eyes, but he didn't try to stop her. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll wait." Isla returned to her old apartment the next morning, the apartment she had kept for the past 3 months, as a backup exit, a place to go if everything fell apart. The room was small and worn down, weak light filtering through the dusty window, and everything lay silent as if time had frozen the moment she left. Pretzel came back with her, the cat jumping onto the bed and curling up in its familiar spot, watching her with golden eyes as if asking why they were here again. Isla sat down beside the cat and looked around the room, trying to remember what it had felt like to live here. She remembered sleepless nights worrying about money, remembered dragging herself out of bed in the mornings even though her body ached from exhaustion, remembered the loneliness pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. This was her normal life, the life she would return to if she chose to walk away from Raphael. But did she really want to go back to it? A knock on the door cut through her thoughts, and when Isla opened it, Tessa was standing there with 2 cups of coffee and a worried expression. "I heard you came back here," Tessa said as she stepped inside and handed Isla a cup. "Are you okay? What happened?" Isla told Tessa everything, from the original agreement to the feelings that slowly grew, from the war with Santini to the fact that the 3 months were over and she was now free. Tessa listened without interrupting, and when Isla finished, she looked at her friend with thoughtful eyes. "So, what are you going to do?" Tessa asked. "Are you going to stay with him, or go back to your old life?" "I don't know," Isla admitted. "I love him, Tessa. I love him so much it scares me, but his world is dangerous, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to live in it." Tessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Isla hadn't expected. "You've lived in danger your whole life, Isla. With your father, with Derek, with fighting every single day just to survive. The only difference now is that you have someone fighting beside you instead of against you." The words hit Isla like a punch because they were true. She had fought alone for 27 years, and Raphael was the first person who stood with her, protected her, loved her, without demanding she become someone else. Tessa left after that, and Isla sat alone with Pretzel in the silent apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. She was just about to make her decision when her phone vibrated. It was Maisie calling from the hospital. "Isla," Maisie said the moment she picked up, her voice unusually serious. "I just talked to Theo. He told me everything. About the war, about how Raphael almost died to save him, about how the 3 months are over." "Maisie," Isla started, but her sister cut her off. "Don't let him go, Isla." Maisie's voice trembled but stayed firm. "I've seen the way he looks at you. He looks at you like you're his whole world, and I've seen how you change when you're with him. You smile more. You live more. You're not just surviving anymore. Someone like him doesn't come twice in a lifetime, Isla. Don't let fear steal your happiness." Isla sat there with tears streaming down her face, and she knew her answer. She had always known, from the moment Raphael told her she was free. She stood up, opened the closet, and took out the burgundy silk dress, the dress Tessa had lent her on that fateful night, the dress she had worn when she first saw Raphael. She changed, smoothed her hair, and called for a car to the penthouse. It was time to make her choice. Isla arrived at the penthouse at sunset, when the last light of the day painted the Manhattan sky red and cast stunning streaks of gold and amber across the skyscrapers. She stepped out of the elevator with her heart pounding in her chest, the burgundy silk dress clinging to her body like a reminder of the night everything began. The penthouse was quiet, and Isla found Raphael standing on the balcony with his back to her, looking out over the city stretched below like a vast carpet of light. He knew she was there. She could see his shoulders tense when he heard her footsteps, but he didn't turn around, as if he was afraid that looking at her would bring bad news, as if he was bracing himself to hear her say goodbye. Isla walked out onto the balcony and stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body but not touching. They stood there in silence for a long while, watching the city sink into darkness as the lights began to flicker on like millions of stars falling to the ground. "I have conditions," Isla finally said, breaking the silence. Raphael didn't turn, but she felt his entire body tighten like a drawn wire. "Conditions?" he asked, his voice rough. "3 conditions," Isla said, and she felt a smile begin to form on her lips. "If you agree to all 3, I'll stay." Raphael turned to her, and Isla saw hope flare in those gray eyes, hope he was trying to restrain for fear of being disappointed. "Say it," he said, his voice almost pleading. "First, you never lie to me," Isla said, looking straight into his eyes. "No matter how ugly the truth is, no matter how much it hurts, I want to know everything. No secrets between us." "Agreed," Raphael said immediately, without a second of hesitation. "Second, I keep my independence," Isla continued. "I won't become your shadow. I won't become decoration in this penthouse. I want my own work, my own life, my own identity. I am Isla Mercer, not an accessory of Raphael Corsetti." "Agreed," Raphael nodded, and she saw respect in his eyes. "I never wanted you to be anyone but yourself." "And third," Isla said, a mischievous smile blooming on her lips, "Pretzel moves in here officially, and you learn to love that cat. No complaining, no grumbling, no looking at him like he's the enemy." Raphael looked at her, and then he laughed. Not the cold or controlled smile she had seen before, but a real smile, bright and beautiful, the first time she had ever seen him smile like that. "Can I negotiate the 3rd condition?" he asked, one corner of his mouth lifting. "No," Isla replied firmly. "That one isn't negotiable." Raphael stepped closer, placed his hands on her waist, and pulled her gently toward him. "Then I agree," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "All 3 conditions. Anything to keep you with me." He kissed her, and Isla kissed him back, and the city shimmered beneath them like a witness to their love. When they pulled apart, Raphael looked at her with eyes full of love she never thought she'd see in this cold Mafia boss. "Welcome home," he whispered. 6 months later, Isla sat in the penthouse that had truly become her home. Pretzel curled on Raphael's lap as if they'd been friends in a past life, and she couldn't stop herself from smiling at the sight. The orange cat had completely conquered the Mafia boss, and Raphael now even spoke to him as if the cat understood every word. Maisie had fully recovered and started college, pursuing her long-held dream of becoming a writer. She visited the penthouse for dinner from time to time, teasing her sister and Raphael, and Isla was happy to see the 2 people she loved most in the world growing close. As for Isla, she had become the official accountant for the legal businesses of the Corsetti family, using the analytical skills she had sharpened over years in that rundown laundromat. She had her own work, her own independence, and a man who loved her for who she was, not for what she was or what she had. "What are you thinking about?" Isla asked, watching Raphael stroke Pretzel with a thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking that you sitting on my lap at that party was the best thing that ever happened to me," Raphael said, lifting his gaze to hers. "Your flirting skills still need work," Isla said, but she was smiling. "But they worked," Raphael replied, one eyebrow lifting playfully. Isla laughed, and her laughter filled the room, warm and genuine. She thought about her journey, from an orphaned girl burdened with her father's debt, from a victim of domestic violence, from a woman working 20 hours a day just to survive, to the woman sitting here now, loved, respected, and allowed to be herself. Life had taken her through hell, but it had also led her to heaven, and her heaven looked like a gray-eyed Mafia boss, a judgmental orange cat, and a penthouse overlooking Manhattan. She no longer lived 2 lives. She lived one life, complex and dangerous and beautiful, beside the man who had once been the devil of the city and had become her personal guardian angel. "Hey," Raphael said, pulling her from her thoughts. "Thank you. Thank you for what?" Isla asked. "For giving me a chance." for seeing the real man behind the walls I built, for loving me even knowing who I am and what I've done. I don't deserve you, Isla, but I'll spend my whole life trying to be worthy of you." Isla placed her hand on his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin and the familiar scar beneath her palm. "You already are worthy," she said. "You were worthy the moment you saw me as a person and not a commodity. You were worthy the moment you gave me a choice instead of forcing me. You are worthy, Raphael Corsetti, and I love you." And he kissed her beneath the Manhattan sunset, with Pretzel meowing in protest at being disturbed. And Isla knew she had found where she belonged. Friends, from this story we learn that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments. Isla never thought that accidentally sitting on a stranger's lap at a party would change her entire life. But life has a remarkable way of bringing the right people together at the right time. The story also reminds us that our past doesn't define our future. Isla endured so much pain, from being abandoned by her father to being abused by the man she loved. But she didn't let those wounds turn her bitter or close her heart. She was still brave enough to love again. And this time, she found someone worthy of that love. Most importantly, the story teaches us that true love doesn't require us to change who we are. Raphael loved Isla for who she was, with all her edges, her scars, and her imperfections. He didn't try to turn her into someone else, didn't try to lock her in a golden cage, but gave her the freedom to be herself, and stood beside her as a true partner. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our emotional stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone in unexpected circumstances who changed your life? Or what are your thoughts about love, forgiveness, and giving someone a second chance? We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart, so please leave a comment below so we can share and connect together. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to watch this video. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Always believe in love and never give up hope, because sometimes happiness is waiting just around the next corner. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.